The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday evening, the kind that didn't just soak you but erased you, made you feel like the city itself was trying to wash you away. Margaret Ellison sat on the steps outside the public library on Clearwater Avenue, the only dry place left to her, a shallow overhang that barely kept the rain off her shoulders. She wore a gray blazer that had once been pressed and professional. Now it hung on her like something borrowed from a different life. In her lap sat a manila envelope, the kind that held paperwork you never wanted to see. Inside it were the signed divorce documents, a termination letter from the firm where she'd worked 11 years, and a single sticky note in her ex-husband's handwriting. Don't call the house again. All three had arrived in the same week, in that order. She wasn't crying. She'd moved past crying somewhere around noon, when she'd realized her keycard no longer worked at the building, and the security guard wouldn't meet her eyes. Now she just sat, watching cars throw white arcs of water across the sidewalk, trying to remember what it felt like to have somewhere to be. The man who stopped in front of her was unremarkable in the way people with quiet confidence tend to be. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, heavyset in a comfortable way, wearing a flannel jacket that had seen better decades. He was holding the hand of a small girl, maybe 7 years old, who was jumping deliberately in every puddle she could reach. Beside him walked a boy who looked about 14, hood pulled up, earbuds in, entirely elsewhere, and just behind them both, a girl of about 10 who was reading something on a battered paperback while somehow navigating the wet sidewalk without looking up. The man glanced at Margaret the way people usually didn't, not the quick flicker of eyes that slid away. He actually looked at her. "You waiting for someone?" he asked. His voice was unhurried, not the voice of a man performing kindness. Just a question. "No," Margaret said. The small girl had stopped jumping puddles and was now staring openly. "She's all wet, Dad. I can see that, Lily." "Are you okay?" the girl asked Margaret, with the devastating directness of a child who hadn't yet learned that you weren't supposed to ask. Margaret looked at her. "I've been better." The man studied her for a moment, not in a way that felt intrusive, more the way a person looks when they're deciding something that actually matters to them. "My name's Daniel Cole," he said. "These are my kids, Lily, Noah, and that's Cora." He nodded toward the reading girl who looked up briefly, assessed the situation, and looked back down at her book. "We live 4 blocks from here. If you need to dry off and get something warm to eat, you're welcome to come." Margaret stared at him. The rain hit the overhang above them in a steady drum roll. "You don't know me," she said. "That's true." He didn't argue with it. "But you're sitting outside in a rainstorm with nowhere to go, and Lily won't stop thinking about it for the rest of the night if we just walk past." The small girl nodded with enormous seriousness. Margaret looked at the envelope in her lap, then at the 3 children who were all watching her now, even Noah, who had pulled one earbud out, even Cora, who had closed her book on her finger to hold her place. She thought about saying no. She'd been saying no to things her whole marriage, no to her own discomfort, no to her own unhappiness, yes to whatever kept the peace. And that approach had landed her here, on these steps, holding a manila envelope that contained the ruins of everything she'd arranged her life around. "Okay," she said. Daniel Cole's house was the kind that looked like people actually lived in it. There were shoes by the door in 6 different sizes, a coat rack so overloaded one sleeve of a rain jacket was dragging on the floor, and a whiteboard on the wall near the kitchen that said, in various handwritings, "Dad, dentist Thursday. Cora, math test tomorrow. Lily, we are out of apple juice." Margaret stood in the entryway and dripped on the welcome mat. "Bathroom's down the hall," Daniel said, already moving toward the kitchen. "There are towels under the sink. I'll put coffee on." Lily grabbed her father's sleeve. "Can she have my fuzzy socks?" Her feet looked cold. "Ask her, not me." The girl turned to Margaret with tremendous gravity. "Would you like my fuzzy socks? They have foxes on them." Something moved through Margaret's chest, quick and unexpected, like the first crack in ice. "I would love that," she said. She came out of the bathroom in borrowed socks and a dry oversized sweatshirt Daniel had wordlessly set outside the door. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something with garlic. Daniel was at the stove, stirring something. Lily was at the table drawing. Cora had set her book down and was chopping tomatoes with the competence of someone who'd been doing it a long time. Noah had disappeared. "Sit," Daniel said without looking up. Margaret sat at the kitchen table. Lily immediately pushed her drawing toward her. "That's our family," she explained, pointing. That's me. That's Noah, but I made his hair wrong. That's Cora. That's Dad. Who's this? Margaret pointed to a figure at the edge of the paper. Lily's face shifted, something quieter moving across it. That's Mom. She goes everywhere with us. We just can't see her. The kitchen went slightly still. Daniel stirred the pot without comment, but Margaret saw his shoulder move in a slow exhale. How long has she been gone? Margaret asked gently. 2 years, Cora said from the counter. Breast cancer. She said it plainly, the way people do when they've said it so many times the words have been smoothed out by repetition, though no less heavy for it. I'm sorry, Margaret said. Dad cried for a long time, Lily offered helpfully. But now he mostly just gets sad at night when he thinks we're asleep. Daniel turned from the stove. Lily. What? It's true. There's a difference between true and necessary. The girl considered this with great seriousness. Okay, but she seems nice, and I think she should know we're not sad all the time. Cora made a sound that was almost a laugh. Noah materialized in the doorway, looked at the scene, and sat at the table without comment, which Margaret would later understand was his version of acceptance. Daniel set a bowl of pasta in front of her. He sat down across from her. You don't have to talk about it, he said. You can just eat. She ate. It was the first hot food she'd had since Sunday. After a while, because the kitchen was warm and the pasta was good. And something about this man made the truth seem less dangerous to say. Out loud, she told him. Not all of it, but enough. 11 years of marriage to a man who measured her value in social return. A career she'd poured herself into at a firm that let her go the moment keeping her became inconvenient. The day, just 8 days ago, when her husband told her calmly over breakfast that he'd met someone who understood ambition better, who would be more useful to where he was headed. Useful. He'd used that word like she was a piece of equipment with a better replacement on order. Daniel listened the way few people did, without filling silences, without the flinch of discomfort. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What did you do before the firm, he asked. I was a social worker, before my ex convinced me it wasn't worth the salary. Something registered in his face. Why'd you listen to him? The question was so simple it almost embarrassed her. I don't know, she said, and then, because it was true, I thought I loved him. The guest room's the second door on the right, Daniel said. You're welcome to stay tonight. Figure out the rest in the morning. You don't have to. I know. He stood and collected the bowls. But my kids are watching me, and I'd rather they see what I actually believe than what's merely convenient. Margaret slept that night in a bed with a quilt that smelled like cedar, in a house that made small sounds, the furnace clicking, a door closing, Lily's laugh from somewhere down the hall in what must have been a dream. And she did not feel safe exactly, because she wasn't sure she remembered what that felt like. But she felt less like she was disappearing. That was something. In the morning there was chaos. Noah couldn't find his geometry homework. Cora was explaining in patient but relentless detail why the school's tardy policy was constitutionally questionable. Lily was upset because someone had eaten the last of the fox-shaped crackers, and she had strong and vocal feelings about this. Daniel was making eggs with one hand and signing a permission slip with the other, and the coffee had gone cold. And there was a dog Margaret hadn't noticed the night before, a large and indifferent golden retriever named Biscuit, eating something off the floor that no one seemed concerned about. Margaret stood in the doorway. Daniel looked up. Coffee's fresh, the other pot. She crossed to the stove. Let me do the eggs. You're going to burn them. He handed her the spatula without debate. Cora appeared at her elbow and watched her technique for a moment. You flip them differently than Dad's way tears the yolk. A pause. That's true, Cora said, with the tone of someone filing away information. She stayed another day, then another. Daniel came home one evening to find she'd reorganized the whiteboard system by color and urgency, and his response was to stand in front of it for 30 seconds and then say, "That's better." He offered to pay her to help manage the household while she figured out her next steps. She refused twice. He explained, the third time, that what he was describing was not charity but a practical arrangement that benefited his family, and that she could take it or he'd find someone else who would, and he'd rather it be her because his children had already decided to keep her. She accepted. The weeks found their shape. She learned that Noah communicated primarily in monosyllables, but would talk for 20 minutes without stopping if you asked him about aerospace engineering. That Cora had read every book in the house and most of the library, and kept a notebook of sentences she considered worth saving. That Lily believed firmly and without irony that Biscuit could understand English but chose not to speak out of personal preference. She learned that Daniel woke at 5, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table for exactly 20 minutes before anything else. Not with his phone, not with the news, just sitting. And that this was, she realized, the only time in his day that belonged entirely to him. She didn't interrupt it. What she learned about Daniel Cole she learned in pieces, the way you learn anything that matters. Slowly, at angles, through what a person does rather than what they say. He was a civil engineer who'd built his own firm from 2 employees and a second-hand truck into something that had quietly reshaped the infrastructure of 3 counties. He drove a 2009 pickup. He wore the same rotation of flannel shirts. He never mentioned money and never seemed to think about it. When the school called about Lily's reading assessment, he left a meeting with a county commissioner to get there within the hour. He was not an easy man to know, but he was, Margaret thought, a consistent one. And consistency, she had come to understand, was rarer than people admitted. 6 weeks in, she found Cora at the kitchen table at 11 at night, staring at a blank piece of paper. Essay, Margaret asked. Personal statement. School competition. Cora's jaw tightened. It's supposed to be about someone who influenced you. Who are you thinking about writing about? The girl was quiet for a long moment. Mom. But every time I start, I can't. I don't know how to say it without it sounding like a list of things she did. I want it to sound like her. Margaret sat down beside her. She didn't offer advice right away. She asked Cora what her mother had smelled like, what she'd said when Cora was upset, what she laughed at, what annoyed her. Cora answered slowly at first, then faster, and the blank page stopped being blank. An hour later, she had a draft. It was unpolished and too long and completely alive. You didn't write any of it, Cora said, reading back over it. It's your mother. I wouldn't know how. The girl looked at her with something that took Margaret a moment to recognize. It was the specific, careful look of someone deciding to trust you. Thank you, Cora said. Margaret nodded and went to bed and lay in the dark feeling something she couldn't immediately name. Useful, she thought, and then stopped because that word had been poisoned. She tried again. Necessary. No, not that either. Wanted. That was closer. She had been wanted here by this girl with her notebook of sentences, by this small family that still left a space in every drawing for a woman they couldn't see. Noah was the one she hadn't reached. He was polite in the manner of someone who had decided that politeness was the minimum safe distance to maintain. He did his work. He helped with dinner. He did not look at her with hostility, only with a neutrality so precise it felt constructed. One afternoon she found him in the garage, bent over a small model rocket with the focused expression of a surgeon. She didn't say anything. She sat on the step stool and watched. After 10 minutes he said, without looking up, "The fins are the part most people get wrong." How so? They calculate drag but not torque. Then the whole thing spins out at 200 feet and it's embarrassing. She asked him about torque. He explained it for 45 minutes. He used his hands when he talked about the parts he loved. He did not use his hands at all when he mentioned his mother. Just went still in a particular way that Margaret recognized, because she did the same thing herself when she talked about the years she'd quietly agreed to be less than she was. When he finally ran out of momentum, he went quiet and then said, "Are you going to stay?" "I don't know yet," she said, because she'd promised herself she would stop lying to feel less. "Dad's different since you've been here." He picked up a small wrench, set it down, not fixed, just. Less like he's standing in one place waiting to fall over. Margaret didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "He's a good man, I know." Noah picked up the wrench again. "I just want to know if you know." She thought about that for a long time afterward. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday, in March, when Daniel came home before dark for the first time in 2 months and found her in the backyard, pulling dead growth from the garden beds that had been left to go to seed. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know. Laura used to do this, didn't she?" It wasn't a question. She'd seen the photo albums. She'd seen the way Daniel's eyes moved across the backyard sometimes, looking at something the children couldn't see. He sat on the back step. "She grew tomatoes back here, and sunflowers. Said the sunflowers were for Lily. I could plant some." He looked at her. In the late afternoon light, the tiredness in his face was very clear, the kind that sleep didn't fix because it wasn't that kind of tired. "Margaret," he said. She sat back on her heels and waited. I don't know how to say this without making it strange, then say it strangely. He almost smiled. Something's happened in the last few months. He was looking at his hands. I didn't look for it. I'm not sure I was ready for it. But I've run out of ways to convince myself it isn't there. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere in the house, Lily was singing something off-key. I think I'm falling in love with you, Daniel said. And I need you to tell me if that's a problem. Because if it is, I'll figure out how to stop, and I won't make it strange, and I won't let it change what's working here. But I can't keep. He stopped. Tried again. I'm not good at pretending things aren't what they are. Margaret was quiet for long enough that a bird landed on the fence, looked at them both, and left. I spent 11 years pretending things weren't what they were, she said finally. I don't want to do that anymore either. She looked at him, this man in his worn flannel jacket, sitting on the back step of the house he'd held together through grief and single parenthood and the ordinary daily weight of keeping 3 children fed and loved and whole. She'd come to this house wet and empty-handed and had somehow found herself thinking of it, without meaning to, as home. I'm in love with you too, she said. I've been trying to figure out if I was allowed. Daniel got up from the step and crossed the garden to her, stepping around the things she'd cleared and the things still waiting. He took her hands, earthy from the garden bed, and held them. You're allowed, he said. The children did not react with the surprise of people who had not seen it coming. Noah said okay and went back to his model. Cora said I know with the air of someone whose notebook of sentences had included this possibility for some time. Lily said, does this mean you'll be here forever? And when Margaret said I hope so, the girl threw both arms around her waist and held on with the strength of someone who had learned not to take presents for granted. That summer was the first one Margaret could remember in over a decade that felt like hers. She enrolled in a part-time program to recertify as a social worker. Daniel drove her to the first class and made no comment about it, which was his version of saying it mattered. She passed her first practicum with a score that made her professor pause and look at her over his glasses. The hard parts didn't disappear. She woke some mornings and heard the old voice, the one that spoke in her ex-husband's cadences, that itemized her shortcomings with the efficiency of a closing argument. There were evenings when she stood in Laura's kitchen making dinner with Laura's children, using Laura's recipe cards, and felt like a woman in a coat that didn't belong to her. She told Daniel once. He listened and said, "You're not wearing her life. You're building something different in the same house." That's allowed too. She held on to that. Cora's essay won the regional competition. She read it aloud at a school assembly in October, and the part about her mother, the part about what it felt like to be 7 years old and have someone explain the stars to you as if you were worth explaining them to, made 2 teachers cry. Margaret sat in the auditorium between Daniel and Lily, who held her hand with both of hers. Afterward, Cora found her in the parking lot. "I used what you said," the girl said, "about writing her the way she sounded, not the way I thought she should sound. It worked." "Yeah." Cora looked at her with those careful, measuring eyes. "I'm glad you stayed. Me too, I didn't think I would be." She said it without apology, just as a fact, but I am. Margaret and Daniel married the following April, quietly in the backyard with sunflowers Lily had grown from seed, because they'd promised her they would wait until the sunflowers were ready, and they'd meant it. Noah stood up front and read something he'd written himself, technical at the edges, and unexpectedly tender at the center, the way he was. Cora played guitar, a song she'd taught herself in secret over the winter. Lily wore a dress she'd selected 3 months in advance and changed her mind about twice and ultimately kept. Margaret wore blue. She'd found the dress herself with no one's input, which felt significant in a way she didn't explain to anyone. When they exchanged their vows, Daniel held her hands and said what he meant, which was what he always did, and she said what she meant too, which she was still learning how to do. And the sunflowers were very tall and very yellow in the late afternoon light. That night, after everyone had gone, Margaret stood in the backyard alone for a few minutes. She thought about the library steps on Clearwater Avenue, the rain, the envelope in her lap. She thought about the word useful and how long it had taken her to understand that it was the wrong word entirely, that what she'd been searching for underneath that word, the real word, was necessary. Not to a man's ambition, not to a firm's quarterly targets, but to the daily life of people who would notice if she weren't there. Who would say so? Who would leave a space for her in every drawing? Daniel came and stood beside her. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the garden that was theirs now, under a sky that was deepening from orange to violet to dark. "You okay?" he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it entirely. 2 years after the wedding, Margaret Ellison, Margaret Cole now, though she used both, because she'd earned both, was hired as a case supervisor at a women's resource center in the county, where she worked with women who'd lost everything, women who sat across from her desk, holding manila envelopes and wearing the expressions of people who were trying to remember who they'd been before someone else's opinion of them became their own. She told each of them the same thing, not as a speech but as something she actually knew. "You are not what they decided you were. You are something that hasn't been named yet. Give it time." She meant it because she'd been on those steps. She'd sat in the rain with the paperwork of a failed life in her lap, and a man in a flannel jacket and his 3 children had stopped in front of her, and the smallest one had asked if she wanted fox socks, and all of it, every small and ordinary and irreversible thing that followed, had been because she said yes.